To conclude Chapter 18, ladies and gentlemen, I'll go over some of the economic issues of the late 19th century. These are very important topics that will follow through pretty much till the end of the Second World War. There is a constantly shrinking money supply in the post-Civil War era. It actually decreased 10% at the same time that the economy and the population is dramatically expanding. This deflation raised the cost of borrowing money as the shrinking money supply enabled lenders to hike their rates that they charged for loans. Creditors supported a sound money policy. They wanted to limit this currency supply because it increased their profits. But those that were in debt, like farmers and others, who constantly have to borrow in order to make ends meet, claimed that this sound money policy had the effect of lowering prices for their crops and herds, and it drove them further into debt. Farmers in the South and the Great Plains had suffered from worsening economic conditions during the second half of the 19th century. Their prices kept dropping, and they also created their own problems by producing too much of the different crops that they planted. They had to compete in an international world food market, and that also hurt them because of the competition that resulted, whereas the manufacturers are being protected by a high tariff. And this leads to problems with greedy local banks or merchants who loan money to buy seed, fertilizer, tools, and other supplies. And as the prices dropped for commodities, so did the income they received, and that prevents them from paying their debts on time. So in the South you have perpetual sharecropping and tenant farming, and out west you have a lot of bankruptcies. Again, they had to sell their products in the open world markets that were unprotected by tariffs. And besides bankers, merchants, and high tariffs, struggling farmers also blamed the railroads, warehouse owners, and food processors, the so-called middlemen, who helped get their products to market. They especially resented the railroads, most of which had a monopoly over the shipping of grains and livestock, and they charged very high rates to ship those products. And there's a political reaction that goes on. In the 1890 midterm elections, voters rebelled not only against the McKinley Tariff, one of the highest ever in American political history, but also they supported the militant New Farm protests. Basically, the Republicans are voted out and the Democrats become the majority in Congress. They demand in the South and in the Midwest an increased coinage of silver, which would inflate the currency and thereby raise commodity prices. Inflation is always favored by debtors. Those who lend money hate inflation because the dollars that they get back are less valuable than the ones that they lent out. But farmers love inflation because now they have more income which to pay their annual debts. And a big situation changed within the country itself. This isn't a very good map, I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, but when Washington, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, and the two Dakotas come in, the representation in Congress radically changes, and that's a big reason why those 1890 midterm elections had the outcomes that they did. They support all of these issues like free silver and trying to regulate railroads. All of these new states had silver mines, and even though they're Republican, they want the federal government to buy more silver. It's available. And these delegates shifted the balance enough to pass the Sherman Silver Purchase Act of 1890, which required Treasury to purchase 4.5 million ounces of silver each month with new paper money. And those inflationary policies, Republicans will claim, set the stage for the currency issue to eclipse all others during the financial panic that would sweep the country in 1893. Some of the other issues here. In the immediate post-Civil War era, the Department of Agriculture sent Oliver H. Kelly on a tour of the South, and he regretted the isolation of those people. And to address this, he helped found the National Grange of the Patrons of Husbandry, better known as the Grange. And the Granger movement was very popular with farmers. It had a membership by 1874 of 1.5 million people. It started out offering social and educational activities, but eventually it promoted cooperatives where farmers could join together to buy, store, and sell their crops to avoid the high fees charged by brokers and other middlemen. And this was very successful. And this is the advertisement of the Grange. The cornerstone of American society, the farmer. Without the food he produces, no man in any occupation can do his job, including the very railroad magnate, the warehouse owners who try to exploit him. Very Jeffersonian. Politically, many farm alliances are formed then to try and bring awareness of these political issues. They emphasize more political action, and they called for the creation of a third party to address their concerns. And out of this, the Populist Party will be formed in 1892, following the success at the local level of Farmers Alliance candidates. And look at what the Populist Party advocates, ladies and gentlemen. Free coinage of silver, what will become the 16th Amendment, postal savings bank, regulation of railroads, which has already been tried to be addressed by the Interstate Commerce Commission, but it's not very effective, and the 17th Amendment, the direct election of senators. All these things will happen. One of the famous Farmers Alliance leaders was Mary Elizabeth Lease, one of the first female attorneys in Pennsylvania. She migrates to Kansas. Spit it out, Eugene. She will migrate to Kansas, and she is one of the leaders of the Farmers Alliance movement and the formation of the Populist Party. This culminates the following year in the worst depression in American economic history. Just 10 days before Cleveland took office, that Philadelphia and Reading Railroad declared bankruptcy, and that set off the Panic of 1893, the worst economic depression. And by 1894, the economy had bottomed out. This depression goes on until the end of the decade, however. In New York City, the jobless rate was close to 35%. 20,000 homeless people camped out at police stations and other makeshift shelters. And Cleveland only made the depression worse by repealing the Sherman Silver Purchase Act and going back to a solely gold standard. Now the lines have been drawn, ladies and gentlemen. You have gold Democrats, silver Democrats. Most of the gold Democrats are mostly in the Northeast, and the Westerners and Southerners are free silver advocates. And the Republican Party is staunchly for a gold standard. And this is a political cartoon that mocks out some of the Populist Party planks and their platform of lunacy. The cartoon says basically they believe they're full of hot air. The Republicans returned in the midterm elections. They gained 121 seats in the House. Only in the solid South does the Democrats maintain their power. The Populists emerged with 6 senators and 7 representatives, and they expected to be a national power in 1896, but their hopes would be dashed. The money question, ladies and gentlemen, through the end of the Second World War. They're supporters of the gold standard, generally moneylenders and industrialists. They wanted to keep the value of money high, whereas supporters of silver and gold coinage were debtors who owe money, so they want to see inflation of the currency. With more dollars in circulation, it's easier for them to pay their debts. The great commoner, ladies and gentlemen, William Jennings Bryan, will electrify in 1896 the Democratic Party convention. and he secures the party's nomination. It was a 20-minute speech, and when it reached its peak, he used Christian imagery with populist anger. I come to speak to you in defense of a cause as holy as the cause of liberty, the cause of humanity. We have petitioned, and our petitions have been scorned. We have begged, and they have mocked when our calamity came. We beg no longer. We entreat no more. We petition no more. We defy them. And then Bryan stretched his fingers across his forehead, and he reached his dramatic conclusion. You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. And then he extended his arms out like he's being crucified, ladies and gentlemen. And the convention goes wild, and they nominate Bryan. You have the gold bugs supporting William McKinley, who is now the Republican candidate, and the Silverites, who support Bryan. And this is a watershed election, ladies and gentlemen. This will solidify Republican control for another generation. Basically, the industrial Northeast supports McKinley and Republican policies. The gold standard, high tariffs, and military spending. Whereas the Democrats of the West and the solid South, from Texas through Carolina, ladies and gentlemen, you can expect this part of the country to vote Democratic until 1968. They support an inflationary policy and government policies that help the poor and those that are in debt. Not in this election. And if you watch the Oliver Stone movie, he believes that the Republicans bought this election, which goes back to what Roscoe Conkling and the New York Machine politicians said at the very beginning of this chapter. If you want to get something done, maybe you have to pay for it. Is that unjust? These are the issues, politically, socially, and economically, that go through the first half of the 20th century.